Emily, something that's been on my mind is trying to visualize, what does a ton of CO2 even look like?
Well, it's a good job we're doing a podcast, Tom, because it's all about visualizations on a podcast. I can actually help you. There's this company called Carbon Visuals, and they've got some great images that help you figure out sort of these abstract numbers that we keep throwing around. So I've got a picture here that demonstrates 1 ton of carbon dioxide, and it's a cube that is 8.13 meters high, and it's sat next to a kind of average suburban semi-detached house, just for scale. And I can tell you that this cube is quite significantly taller than the house and definitely wider than this house.
So 1 ton is roughly the equivalent of a semi-detached house in terms of size.
Well, no, it's like a big semi-detached house. A semi-detached mansion, maybe.
Oh, wow, okay. I learn something new every day. And we haven't even started yet.
Oh, man.
Hi listeners, and welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show. I'm Tom Praviti, and as ever, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Emily Swaddle.
Welcome back, everyone. In today's episode, we're going to be asking if technology can help us overcome some of the hurdles that we've discussed so far. Last time we finished by discussing BECCS, but we really only gave you half the picture. I think we were pretty clear on the BE and on the K, but in this episode, we want to address the storage.
We want to go into that and further. We're going to be looking at the storage element of BECCS and also taking a look at the technological innovations that might allow us to store without the need for burning plants in the first place.
Yeah, every solution we've talked about so far has involved plants or biomass in some way or another. And as we've mentioned many times, it is super important to restore and protect natural ecosystems, as well as getting our agricultural land in better shape. But we also know that in terms of carbon capture, these solutions have limits in scalability due to land use and other resources, and they lack the permanence and measurability that we really need for this industry to gain traction.
Exactly. Biomass may be the natural way to draw down carbon, but is it the only way? As we continue piecing together a fuller picture of the opportunities out there, we're going to look at more tech-based solutions, such as DAC or direct air capture in this episode, to understand whether human engineering can provide an additional solution to the problem. And importantly, do we want it to?
Okay, let's talk storage.
It's hard to believe we've mentioned permanence so many times, and this is the first chance we've actually really had to looking at storage beyond hope the soil holds onto a lot of carbon.
Yeah, that's very true. So back to my favourite acronym briefly, BECCS. The CCS part is often heard as a standalone thing without its BE pals. CCS, or carbon capture and storage, has been around for decades on a small scale on conventional fossil fuel plants. We'll get into that later because, yes, it has its flaws and controversies. But let's start with what it is and what it can do.
Well, we already know that the CCS in BECCS allows us to store carbon that was previously floating around the atmosphere and was then captured by our plant friends.
Right. But what do we do with the carbon once we've captured it? One way to be sure it goes somewhere and stays there is to take it out of the carbon cycle entirely and store it somewhere.
Like back underground?
Yeah, exactly. One of the most developed and most promising storage techniques is geological sequestration. That's a fancy way of saying that the carbon is compressed into a liquid and then pumped deep down beneath the earth. We spoke with Dr. Catherine Romanak. She's a research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology in Texas, and she's an expert in environmental monitoring at geological CO2 storage sites. Dr. Romanak asked us to think about this process in terms of the reverse of oil and gas production. We're putting something back where it came from.
That's kind of a tagline. It's like we're putting it back where we got it, because there's a lot of people that have a hard time, understandably, understanding geology and how does that work. And I don't understand, how do you put carbon dioxide deep in the earth? Isn't it a rock? And how do you get it in there and all that? But I think that if we think of it as the reverse of oil and gas production, because we know that there are fluids that reside in the earth, oil and gas and salty water, reside within these small spaces that are deep in the earth. And so we know that oil and gas can be trapped for millions of years, and we know that we can extract it and we can burn it and we can get energy and carbon dioxide. And then if we capture that carbon dioxide, we can compress it into a liquid and we can put it right back down the very same well that we got the oil and gas out of. So it's literally putting it back where we got it. But there's one thing to be very, very aware of, and that is that we are not only talking about fossil fuels here. We're talking about many, many industrial sources of carbon dioxide. It's not just the burning of fossil fuels. It is cement production, iron and steel production, many other industries that are emitting carbon dioxide.
This brings to mind the carbon cycle that we talked about back in episode 1. You can really clearly see where this captured carbon will sit with Catherine's description, deep, deep underground. So we really have sort of removed it from the cycle.
Yeah, it's deep underground, and it's not in a form where it might burn or decompose or be released into the atmosphere in any way. Tom, I don't know if I dare say this, but you know what this is, right?
A miracle? Lifesaver? I don't know. What is it?
Yeah, it is all those things, because it's permanence.
Oh, permanence. Yes. So we can finish this podcast. Let's wrap things up now then.
If only, my friend, if only. Okay, we have to break this process down, and we can think about it in 2 parts. Getting it down there and keeping it down there. So getting the carbon down there requires a space wherever down there is, and a way of getting the carbon there, so infrastructure to do that. In terms of the storage space, we're looking for large spaces around kind of like 1 kilometre or more underground. These might be natural saline or basalt formations, or they might be pre-existing oil fields, gas fields, or coal seams.
Nice. In those cases, presumably some of the existing infrastructure then can be useful in getting that carbon back underground.
Yeah, it really is useful to have some existing infrastructure in place, for sure.
I really like the circularity of that in a way. We kind of took it out in the first place, and now we're putting it right back where we found it.
Yeah, I agree. It feels right, somehow. The thing is, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about more than just like a couple of mobile offices and a portaloo. There's infrastructure needed for the capture process, of course, and the storage process, and then also the transportation in between. Transport can take the form of ship, tanker, or pipeline, so there's more infrastructure needs to be aware of. And once we've done all of that to get the carbon underground, we also have to make sure it stays down there. Catherine explained how to ensure permanence.
What we have found is that, first of all, we know the right places to put CO2. We're not just going in and slapping it down there. We need to find places that have room in the rocks to put it. And we also go through a lot of effort to ensure that above that reservoir, above that place we're going to put the CO2, there are rocks that are so tight that have no space in between that will cause a barrier. So the CO2, even if it tried to rise up, it couldn't rise up because we have what we call sealing layers above. And so we do a lot of work to make sure that at first we find the right places to put CO2. So really, the main concern that we have about CO2 coming back up would be through the wells themselves, because it's the wells that actually punch holes, if you will, through those sealing layers. And so it's the wells that we need to ensure are constructed correctly. And what we have for that are regulations. And we have rules for how you are to drill a well and complete a well and operate a well. And so what we really need to do is we need to make sure that the regulations are followed and that they're good and that the regulations are enforced.
It's sort of ironic that the only major risk factors for CO2 release are the oil and gas wells, which were the things that led to a lot of this problem in the first place. If we just back up a second, what kind of leak are we actually talking about here? I can see how a sort of puncture in a bicycle tyre sized leak could be really manageable, but is it possible to get something like a volcanic eruption sized leak?
That's a good question, Tom. The first thing to note is that size eruption, as you say, is actually really unlikely. And that's because the sites are chosen really carefully and they're very well suited to storing carbon. Oftentimes, they're sites that have actually been storing carbon in the form of oil or gas for a really, really long time. However, that doesn't mean we can sort of go easy on the monitoring thing.
What are the risks we're looking at?
Well, one risk is oxygen displacement. CO2 is very dense and can displace oxygen, creating a risk of asphyxiation for those nearby any leak. The good thing is that wind and diffusion would quickly spread this around, so the risk is temporary. But there was one natural disaster that I read about that I want to share with you at Lake Nyos in Cameroon. So, like I said, this was a natural disaster, so it's not really the same thing. But hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 erupted from the lake. And in this instance, the effect of that CO2 killed 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock. So it was a really big deal. We should also note that the amount of CO2 that erupted in this instance is like orders of magnitude more than we would expect from any kind of eruption from carbon storage underground that we would be undertaking. But again, it just highlights the seriousness of all this.
Are there any other risks?
Yes, there are some we know of. If there were to be a leak, it could indeed affect local plant life.
As far as the biosphere goes, so much research has been done, and you can actually get information on specific crops, but basically the impacts are very localized, so they're not spread out. There'll be a small patch or a localized patch where, yes, you can get some of the biota can be damaged, some of the plants can be damaged. And again, then that's only going to come back once you stop the leak. But once you stop the leak, then that can be recovered as well.
These risks remain very localized and temporary, but they do deserve some of our attention. Ultimately, the overall benefit of negative emissions to the biosphere is very likely to outweigh the risks, to be honest. Just one more I want to mention is acidification of groundwater, which in turn releases metals into the water system.
First of all, if you talk about groundwater, so drinking water sources that we get from our shallow aquifers, so our concern is not the carbon dioxide in the water, right? Because if you put CO2 in water, you get Perrier. You just get, something that people pay more money for than the still water, right? But the concern there is that when the carbon dioxide enters the aquifer, you get a lowering of the pH, so you get an acidification, which I think your listeners can understand that. And then what can happen then is that some of the minerals that are in the rocks where the water is residing can dissolve. And if there's some small traces of metals within those minerals, they will be released into the groundwater. So there's been a lot of study on this. We do see an increase in the metals that are released into the aquifer water, but they never go above drinking water quality standards, and it always reverses itself. So it's a short-lived phenomenon. So that has made us feel much better about the fact that if there was a slight chance of a leak into the aquifer, that it would be very easily remediated and that the impacts would not be as bad as we first thought that they might be.
So drinking water remains safe. That is reassuring.
Yeah, it is, but it's still something to keep in mind.
So I suppose all the potential risks impact how these processes are carried out rather than whether they're carried out then.
Yeah, exactly. And also where. When building the infrastructure for all this, we need to think, okay, where are the pipes going? Which communities are going to be at risk should a leak occur? And, certainly if we're utilizing existing mines or oil or gas fields, these may be in communities that are already less affluent or less supported, which could affect, ease of access to healthcare, for example. It quickly becomes a social justice issue, so it has to be taken into consideration from the very beginning.
Yeah, agreed. This is such an important aspect of all this. And I'm just thinking, it's obviously vital to be aware of the risks, but also to think about that risk probability impact matrix. From what Catherine has said, it seems quite unlikely that something like a leak would occur, given the regulations and the monitoring that are in place. And even if it did, compared to the damage, say, an oil leak might have, and we've all seen the photos of that sort of devastation.
Yes. In most cases, the risks of leakage are far less than the risks from fossil fuel production. In addition to the risks, I want to mention a few of the challenges that this technology faces as it's developing. It seems like it really has a lot going for it, but like with everything, there are hurdles to get over.
I've got one hurdle.
Go on then.
Who's going to pay for this? Sticking my capitalist hat on. It might be great for our planet and all, but that doesn't pay the bills.
Yeah, you nailed it, Tom. It can be a costly process, and as you say, sequestering something means there's no real economic incentive. Pushes from policy could really help with that, which obviously requires political will to prioritise this process. In order to improve this technology and scale it up, we need incentives.
And oftentimes, political will follows public will. So, in general, is this something people are getting behind?
Well, unfortunately, CCS has had some PR problems. I mentioned it's been around for decades. Well, it's actually mostly being used not in BECCS, but by the oil and gas industry.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So, firstly, CCS allows oil and gas companies to reduce the carbon released from burning fossil fuels and meet emission reduction targets. And secondly, for those drilling oil, the captured carbon is actually useful because it can be injected into an oil field and it allows them to get more oil out in a process called enhanced oil recovery. So CCS has a complex history, and this has led to some negative public perceptions around the process. And we agree that we need to scrutinise how it's used and its environmental impact on probably a case-by-case basis, really.
What we're looking at here with CCS, although it can lead to a negative emissions outcome, for example with BECCS, it's not a negative emission technology on its own. The carbon capture part of this isn't necessarily removing CO2 from the atmosphere, it's merely abating or preventing it from entering the atmosphere.
Exactly. CCS is just a tool. How it's used is the thing that really makes the difference. Ultimately, though, we've talked a lot about permanence throughout this series, and we've looked at methods of sequestration that promise us 10 years, 100 years, and so on. But even if we trust the world will significantly decarbonise over the next few decades, we don't want to create a time bomb for ourselves. Catherine explained why geological sequestration has the edge here.
Permanence is a really important topic as well. There's a lot of talk about nature-based solutions for capturing CO2. For example, forestation and all of these really great ways that we can use our biosphere to store carbon dioxide. We have to realize the fact of permanence. And I think that's one thing where geological CO2 storage is absolutely one of the best things we can do, because once we put it down there, it's down there. It's not coming back. If you have a forest fire or if your land use practices go away, then the nature-based solutions may not be as permanent. But again, these are great solutions. They're solutions that we need. But I do want to outline the fact that the permanence of geological CO2 storage, it can't be matched by any other technology.
So, we've talked about how CCS can help us abate and sequester carbon that's being released through human activities, and either as an add-on to otherwise carbon-positive technologies like fossil fuel burning or industrial processes, or to more carbon-neutral sources like biofuel. But what about all that carbon that's getting into the atmosphere anyway, and the many years of emissions that we're currently dealing with, that legacy CO2 that's already warming up the planet?
Yeah, if there's anything we've established over the past few weeks, it's that there's a lot of carbon out there. We've got gigatons of this stuff. And some of it as a result of things like aviation and cement production, and they're going to be really slow and difficult to decarbonise.
A solution, which is getting a lot of people excited at the moment, is DAC, or DAC, which stands for direct air capture. And just like how trees or other biomass capture the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere through photosynthesis, DAC is designed to pull carbon dioxide directly from the air.
Yeah, it sounds like the clue's sort of in the name with this one. All right, quick confession, Tom. Months ago, when we first started looking at all these solutions, I remember struggling to understand some of the differences between DAC processes and the CCS process. I genuinely sometimes get them confused. As I understand it, they both sort of work like a large-scale filter, almost, for carbon dioxide. even though we use them in very different places.
I think that's totally understandable. I too was struggling to kind of draw the line between these different technologies. And so something to bear in mind is that capturing CO2 in the atmosphere is a very different challenge to capturing it at a point source, for example, from a flue stack or through BECCS. I spoke to Steve Oldham, the CEO of a direct air capture company called Carbon Engineering, to learn more about this difference.
It's completely separate technology. And the reason is it's the quantity of CO2. So in, for example, a flue stack, the CO2 quantity within the flue stack emission is much, much higher. So it's a lot easier to pull out the CO2. It's a bit like panning for gold. The more gold that's in there in the first place with your sieve as you pan for gold, the easier it is to find some. In the atmosphere, it's 400 parts per million. So this is a lot harder to do, which is why direct air capture has taken longer to develop. And also, frankly, why today it's more expensive, because it's inherently harder to do. So flue stack capture is great, fully support everybody doing flue stack capture, but it's an easier problem. And of course, the problem with flue stack capture is you capture the CO2 in all these locations, but then you have to do something with it. You have to pipe it across the country to somewhere where it's safe to put CO2 underground. Direct air capture can go anywhere because air is everywhere. So we eliminate the need for those pipelines. We build our facilities on top of the sequestration site.
Okay, sounds good. What's actually going on here though? What does a DAC facility consist of? I'm picturing sort of like a metal rainforest.
Okay, so Emily, imagine you're driving in an electric car, obviously.
Obviously.
You're driving past a direct air capture facility, and the first thing that you would see is this big wall of fans towering overhead, blocking out sunlight.
Okay, one question. What kind of fans are we talking? Like, do they look like wind turbines? Is it like the fan I have on my desk? Is it like a sort of pretty lacy number that a flamenco dancer might use?
Probably less likely to be the last one, but...
That would be pretty though. I'd quite like to see that on the side of the road.
Yeah, well, who says carbon removal technologies can't be beautiful?
Exactly.
But it's not quite. If you imagine more like a slow-moving jet turbine, and you have these stacked on top of each other. Now, these fans play an important role, but are not actually the part where the thing happens. Fans draw in the ambient air, so imagine a hairdryer. If you put your hand in front of the back of it, it's sucking it in. In layman's terms, the air then slips through these fans, then makes contact with some sort of contactor. So that's either a solid sorbent or a liquid solvent. And now this is where the magic happens. The contactor separates the CO2 from the air, and the CO2 is then pried off the contactor. And what we're left with is 1, cleaner air, and 2, a concentrated form of CO2.
That does sound like magic. Nice.
Steve Oldham's company, Carbon Engineering, is one of a handful of DAC companies who are taking this technology out of the laboratory. Steve described Carbon Engineering's particular approach to this process.
If you're going to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, you have to absorb it into something. You have to have a chemical reaction and absorb it into something. So what do you then do with that something? And an analogy here would be, imagine spilling milk on the floor. You get your sponge, and your sponge fills up with milk, and then you either have to wring it out or you replace the sponge. So we go the former model. We regenerate the chemicals that we use. And that's really important, because if you're going to do this at large scale, you can't be throwing away the chemicals that you use as part of your process on a continuous basis. You're just going to run out of those chemicals, and you create another problem somewhere else in having to dispose of them all. So our technology actually remakes the absorbent on a continuous basis. Think of it as constantly wringing out the sponge and restarting again. And we think that's a critical element of making this technology available at large scale.
I love the commitment to reuse there. Something we're learning all the time is that these technologies have environmental and resource costs. Does this process actually work though? Like, honestly, I'll be honest, I haven't seen too many DAC plants around the place as I've been on my travels,
Yeah, it absolutely does work though, Emily. But at the moment, it's only being utilised on a very limited scale. So Carbon Engineering, they're a Canadian-based company, and they've got a test plant in British Columbia. This isn't designed to be commercial yet, but it has been operating and proving the concept since 2015. And it's able to remove about 1 ton of CO2 every day. For scale, that's about 3 weeks of the average American citizen's emissions. So the need to scale it up is clear. But if you don't trust my optimism, perhaps you'll be swayed by some of their investors, like Bill Gates, or some fuel companies even, like Chevron and BHP.
Big names, big names. Yeah, I mean, I can totally see why fossil fuel companies might want to invest sort of in carbon removal technologies in general, and we'll probably dig into that later on. But when we're looking at the choices that we've already discussed, I'm just thinking that carbon dioxide concentration at a flue stack is obviously much higher. And so therefore capturing it there makes so much more sense to me than in like a random field in Canada where the level of CO2 is like so much lower. And beyond that, considering the challenges of DAC, why choose this for investment over so many of the other great ways that we've talked about over the episodes to draw down that carbon?
Well, there are several potential benefits which bring DAC together as this pretty unique approach in this space. The first, which we've already touched on, is that DAC allows us to capture carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So in this sense, it's much like trees or other biomass. But added to this, it has the potential to store this carbon more permanently and is likely to be less vulnerable to changes in climate or natural disasters like our nature-based friends. Secondly, as Steve mentioned earlier, DAC facilities can theoretically go pretty much anywhere. With the CCS technologies, we need the technology and infrastructure at the point of emission. And with DAC, we could locate these at the point of sequestration, for example, which would reduce energy and the transport burden. And we could also focus these on areas that are preferable, for other reasons, such as to minimize ecosystem disruption or to generate jobs where they're needed. And finally, DAC is less needy in terms of land use than many other methods. Steve claimed that DAC delivers 100 times more carbon sequestration per acre than any other currently viable method, and that we could deal with the world's entire emissions by building DAC plants over an area equivalent to, say, just the island of Tenerife. Not saying that we want to build everything on the island of Tenerife, obviously. And we've talked so much about the competing demands on our land over recent episodes that this feels like a game changer.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And it does sound like DAC is a bit of a no-brainer if we can get it to scale. Obviously, as you said, hopefully leaving the island of Tenerife with some land that isn't DAC-based. Here's the thing though, Tom. I've been around this podcast world long enough to know that we're going to start diving into some of the complications now. You've been painting me a beautiful picture, but come on, hit me. What's the downside?
So, as with any solution, we need to think about resource intensity. And with DAC, the first of these is actually water usage.
I knew it. I knew there'd be something.
So we understand that different methods of DAC have different water needs. And Steve made the point that carbon engineering's method is actually less water intensive than the equivalent of afforestation, for example. But some methods do still require significant water input. And this could compete with human or irrigation requirements in parts of the world where water is or is becoming scarce. The second is energy intensity. DAC plants require a big energy input. And if we're sourcing this from unclean sources, we're exacerbating the problem we're trying to solve here. Steve described how carbon engineering is dealing with the issue.
We power our plants mostly through renewable electricity. Our early plants will also use natural gas. That's a part of the process. We heat up calcium carbonate in a piece of equipment called a calciner, and that allows us to regenerate the sponge, to go back to that analogy. Very important to say, when we do that, all the emissions from the natural gas are captured as part of our process. So when I talk about a 1 megaton plant, it's 1 megaton of atmospheric CO2. And then we also capture any CO2 from any natural gas we use. Again, the beauty of direct air capture is the location independence. So what we do is we will build a plant with additional renewable electricity. So we don't go and build a plant in some large scale city where renewable electricity is needed to replace fossil fuel. We're actually building new renewable energy plants alongside our plants so that we take all of the energy from those plants and power our plant. So that energy wasn't going to be used for anything else. It's in a remote location or wherever you happen to be. We also get the benefit, because we're not using storage or transmission, the cost of that energy is a lot cheaper. We're in the process of designing a plant that will replace the use of natural gas, but we figure the world needs this technology now, and we need to bring it to market now. So we'll use natural gas in the near term. We'll capture all the emissions, so there's no climate impact.
Carbon engineering's approach here shows that this is possible to do in a way that doesn't create an energy burden, but it does start to highlight the complexity of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, we need to think about not only what type of energy we're using, but also where it's coming from and whether we're competing with existing infrastructure or communities for that energy. Just the premise of having to create more energy to clean up the mess created by our existing energy sources, I don't know, it just kind of gives me a bit of a headache. And it does sometimes feel like we're over-engineering our way out of this crisis.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from, Emily. Every solution creates yet more problems. And on top of all of this, we need to be aware of the chemicals that we're using in the process. As Steve already touched on, they've chosen a liquid solvent, which allows them to reuse the chemicals, but there are diverse approaches here.
So our friends at Climeworks and Global Thermostat, they use a solid absorbent. We use a liquid absorbent. So our sponge is actually a liquid. So there are pros and cons. Our technology is more energy intensive. However, we remake our absorbent. The solid guys don't. And also the solid absorbents have to operate in a vacuum, and it's hard to do vacuum at large scale. You can't make a big area of vacuum. And if you do smaller ones, you need to replicate many, many times. So our view is that liquid solvents are the better way to go for large scale, and our climate problem is large scale. But again, let me emphasize, every tool put to the problem is a good tool. So we think Climeworks Global Thermostat, they absolutely will have a role to play here.
It's obviously a balancing act. And again, this shows the complexity of the calculations these companies are making. Finally, and partly as a result of this resource intensity, DAC is a lot more expensive at the moment than many other forms of carbon removal. Now, there's a tendency to talk in terms of cost per tonne of CO2 removal, and another DAC company, Climeworks, estimate that the current cost of CO2 removal through this process is in the region of about $600 a tonne. Now, the expectation is that this will reduce to $200 to $300 a tonne over the coming years, and future hope is that if this is deployed at a large scale, prices could reach as low as $100 a tonne in the long term.
I know we need to be super skeptical making these sorts of comparisons with these figures because we're dealing with wide ranges and a really high level of uncertainty as to future costs. Everything's just being modelled right now. But it's worth noting that a lot of the methods we've looked at so far, although at the time we didn't really talk about cost per tonne, are already indicating a cost well beneath that $100 per tonne mark. So I can see why this is a really big hurdle.
Absolutely. But Steve explained why we shouldn't see this cost as representing the whole picture.
So the danger is if we said tomorrow the worldwide price on carbon is $50, great. That will encourage progress up to the point where the cost of abatement is $50. But what happens is my company, I go off and play golf because $50 doesn't allow you to do direct air capture. So we just killed off all the innovation required for all the rest of the curve. And fantastic, we'll make great progress up to the $50 point, and then we stop. So the counter to that, people will say, well, then we go to $100. But this type of technology like direct air capture would have been coming down the cost curve, becoming more affordable and more available if we enabled it from day one. So I think you need a system in which you enable the technologies which we're going to need to deal with the harder parts of the abatement curve and the legacy emissions, while also encouraging people to put a price on carbon that's affordable and that people can stomach at the electoral level. So to me, there needs to be a differentiation of some sort. Otherwise, we will halt the development of these technologies like ours that are going to be needed before we're done.
Yeah, I also think we need to move a bit beyond the cost per tonne concept, because we've seen how not all CO2 removal is equal. If DAC is really promising that permanence that we've been lacking, thanks in large part to my good friend geological sequestration, might I add, then we can't really compare it against the sort of sequestration we're getting from afforestation or regenerative agriculture and those other examples. They're just such different processes with different benefits and different costs for these benefits. I suppose, if we're looking at a pure carbon sequestration measure, DAC certainly has a lot of potential.
Agreed. No 2 tonnes are created equal. And Steve's point here is that we need to invest in it now to start bringing down that cost. And we don't know what our emissions picture is going to look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years. And if we need DAC to help us reach net zero, we want to make sure that we've given it a fighting chance to deliver in a way that we can stomach economically. And to deal with these cost considerations and to help this technology become more viable, many DAC companies have looked at how they can generate revenue from the CO2 they've captured. There are a number of ways to do this, but a popular one, depending on who you talk to, is selling it to those who want to use it for enhanced oil recovery.
Uh-oh, here we go again.
Which we have already touched on, yes. And although this retains the benefit of the initial removed carbon, it also enables further fossil fuel emissions. So you'll then want to capture that carbon at source to prevent this contributing to further atmospheric CO2.
Sorry, but it just sounds like the beginning of another hard to get out of cycle. You know, we capture carbon, use it to pump oil out of the ground, only to capture the carbon it releases again, and keep using it for fossil fuel production, and round we go. We're not actually solving the issue of too much carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah, but some of the only people who can afford to pay for this in the first place are oil and gas companies. Shouldn't they be paying the high price for this new technology in order to lower that cost in the long term such that others can afford it? Another possible revenue stream is the generation of synthetic fuel from the carbon itself, creating this carbon neutral energy source. Now, this is obviously far from the permanent sequestration that we're looking for, again, and leads us into a wider argument which Steve addressed. He explained that in order to make the technology viable, we need to face the reality that we live in a fossil fuel powered economy.
The plants that we're building in the Permian Basin, we have all said from day one that some of those plants will be used for negative emissions and some of them will be used for what you call enhanced oil recovery. And we've said that the ratio and the speed of that depends on the market. If nobody wants to buy negative emissions, if the government policies don't come into place, enhanced oil recovery helps us close the economics. But I want to emphasize enhanced oil recovery in this context is maybe not as bad as some people would perceive. What happens when we do enhanced oil recovery is we're pulling more CO2 out of the air than is contained in the crude that comes back up. So just stop and think about that for a second. Imagine if I called you up and I said, I just invented carbon neutral fossil fuel. I've just found out that fossil fuel actually doesn't have to have a carbon footprint. Everybody in the world uses fossil fuel today. It's raised our standard of living. It's essential in many economies all around the world. So if you had a way in which you could make it carbon neutral right now, is that a bad thing? I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we have to face the reality that we can't stop using fossil fuel overnight or even anytime soon.
Oh man, I'm not a fan of that reality, but I suppose it's true. I take his point, but it feels like we have a lot of slippery slopes here. You know, we're really having to trust these DAC companies to ensure that their overall process is carbon negative, because there are just so many areas where it might lead to further emissions, whether that's from the energy required to power it, the enhanced oil recovery it might enable, or the synthetic fuels it might help to produce. As you touched on, Tom, Carbon Engineering has received investment from and is partnering with fossil fuel companies. And I know from reading about this space that this is true of other DAC companies as well. Fossil fuel companies have a lot of interest in this technology, not only because it helps them offset or reduce their emissions, but also because it might help them get the most out of the fossil fuel reserves that we still have left. It feels like this is a really strong relationship, and I'm just keen that we don't let DAC become another excuse for business as usual for the oil and gas industry.
This is definitely something to be aware of, and there's certainly some public unease about this. And DAC, in a way, is a tool, similar to CCS. We have no control over who uses this tool, especially in its infancy, and it really depends on who's willing to invest.
For the past few episodes, we've been talking a lot about permanence. We never shut up about it. And it felt like for the first time in this episode, we actually got a sense of what that might look like in real life. You only need to have seen the news of forest fires this year all over the world to get the sense that carbon stored in biomass really isn't safe for long periods. And as much as we really should be reforesting and regenerating these natural lungs of the earth, we also have to deal with this huge surplus of CO2 we've got floating around in the atmosphere. We want it gone, and we don't want it coming back again.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that geological sequestration isn't the only form of permanent sequestration. There are other exciting solutions that also get rid of this carbon dioxide in a fairly permanent way. You could think of enhanced weathering, which basically mineralizes carbon and locks it away in the form of rock. So if anyone's interested in alternatives, there are a lot out there, but pumping it underground and often back where we've taken it from seems like a promising approach.
As we've been sort of discussing all this throughout this episode, my brain's just been whirring away. I don't know, I suppose I'm looking at the deep sort of relationship between these technologies and the fossil fuel industry with a very critical eye. And I admit that that relationship is probably partly due to the fact that we are dealing in the fossil fuel companies' territory. You know, we're putting things in the ground and they are pulling things out of the ground. So it's kind of like their realm. But I think it's also part of it is that it might just allow them to continue doing what they're doing in some form. And that's the moral hazard. You know, even as policy gets stricter and stricter, it's just business as usual.
You make a really good point about being wary of the moral hazards associated with these technologies. But from what we can tell, comparing these different approaches, DAC doesn't compete as much with those natural resources as other removal processes. And in a future which will no doubt be powered by cheaper renewable energy, DAC becomes so much more economical. And it's also super absolute. You know, there's no estimating with DAC, like how many tons are in this, acre of soil, for example. With DAC, you have that concentrated ton of CO2 right there in front of you. And secondly, the permanent, as we've mentioned, is so important here. The natural solutions just can't offer permanent storage as concrete as something like DAC can. And for me, this conversation is showing the real need for that range, the range of removal options, the toolkit of removal options that we talk about. For example, if we just focused on reforestation, we would simply just not have enough available non-competing land to do this on. Similarly, if we just took the BECS route, we'd compete with our cropland, and even if we just focused on DAC right now, the energy demands and the pricing would just make it totally unfeasible. So having multiple options and not putting all our eggs in one basket is so key at this point in time.
Yes, Tom, you're right. We do love diversity. And we can't just rely on one solution. You know, we've said that throughout so far, in every episode we said we need to do everything that we can.
And touching on that high price point, which we've been discussing throughout this episode with direct air capture, if you look at any new technology and its cost curve over time, the solar panel industry, for example, since 2010 alone, solar panel costs have fallen by over 80%. And as a technology improves and the market grows, these technologies like DAC will inevitably become cheaper.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, actually. And it's super important. Yeah, because it is expensive and it really highlights a central problem, that there is no inherent economic benefit to sequestering something. The cheaper options of carbon removal that we've looked at, they're going to be more attractive to companies or individuals who are looking for sort of like quick offset solutions, which is laudable. And policy will have a huge role to play, of course, as we've already mentioned, to make all this removal possible. But even that will have an upper price limit. So as much as we want that CO2 to go away permanently, capturing it and storing it underground in this way is expensive. So I suppose we shouldn't really be surprised that fossil fuel companies, with all the resources at their fingertips, are the ones who are stepping up to see how it can benefit them. And I've always said, Tom, and I do stand by this, that it's really important to include everyone in this conversation of like a transition towards sustainability and a low carbon future. And that includes fossil fuel companies. It has to. They're such an important part of the conversation. I think sometimes I just get a bit skeptical of their motives, I suppose.
No, I totally agree. Fossil fuel companies have, as we said, they've got the infrastructure, they've got resource, they've got knowledge. And that alone, if used in a positive way, benefits the advancement of the carbon removal sector. And so we really should be working together in the best way possible.
Yes, that's very true.
And beyond that, there are in fact other ways that this carbon can be utilised, which might go some way to actually funding itself.
That would be amazing. No more relying on these big money oil companies. Very cool.
Tune in for the next episode.
If you feel inspired by what you've heard so far and wish you could do more to rid the atmosphere of carbon, then great news, you can. One of our sponsors, Patch, is the API-first marketplace for negative emissions that makes it easy for businesses and their end customers to neutralise their carbon footprint.
Patch works with companies in crypto, fintech, e-commerce and more to embed carbon removal projects into their products and services, or provide their users with the option to purchase carbon removal right at checkout. That means businesses can build carbon negative products and features that enable climate action at scale.
Build something climate positive with Patch. Head to patch.io to learn how.
Thanks so much to our team who make this series possible.
Our researcher and fact checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver-Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floy. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Carbon Removal Show. So far, we've focused on the technological and practical hurdles to carbon removal. And next episode, we're going to start looking at how to overcome the financial hurdles.
Do not forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Seriously, you better do it.
Wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about carbon removal and our podcast, visit restored.cc.
Co-fruition.